Hello everybody, this is Ian here, and welcome back to part 4 of my series where I rank the missing serials of Doctor Who from those who want recovered the least to those who want recovered the most. Today we're cracking the top 10 with numbers 10 to 6, and again, this ranking is not necessarily in order of how much I like these stories, but that is definitely a factor because a person is more likely to care if a story they like is recovered versus a story they do not like. Also remember that these are just my opinions and I'm not trying to express them as facts, and if you disagree with me, then put your thoughts in the comments below. Anyway, starting off today's list, we have number 10, The Highlanders. The Highlanders. Patrick Troughton's second outing as the Doctor and the last historical story. While enjoyable in its own unique way, The Highlanders is a fairly mediocre story that shows both the production team's lack of interest in historicals and the writing team's uncertainty in how to write Patrick Troughton as the Doctor. It wouldn't be until the Moonbase that the show finally nailed down his character. That said, I do think this serial is quite good and quite enjoyable. Yes, the actual story is, as I said, pretty unremarkable, but it's in other ways that this story excels. Foremost among those positives are the characters. This serial has an incredibly strong guest cast and very memorable characters, not the least of which is Jamie McCrimmon, future companion, and this brings me to the first reason why the Highlanders get so high on this list. This serial is the introduction story for Jamie, undoubtedly one of the most famous and popular companions of all time, and a part of what many consider to be one of the best, or even the best, Doctor-companion duo, along with the likes of 4 and Sarah Jane and 10 and Rose. And we're missing his introduction story. The fact that a recovery of this would mean the chance to see Jamie's first ever story elevates it fairly high on this list by itself, but that brings me on to point number 2. Not only is this story incomplete, it's completely missing. All we have are telesnaps and a few seconds of footage from episode 1. Reason 3, the Doctor's hat. That's it. I just want an episode to survive where the Doctor wears his giant stovepipe hat. Reason 4. For being Troughton's second story, it's arguably his funniest. The gags in this one just don't stop. One moment he's trying on hats, the next he's pretending to be a German doctor named literally Doctor of Who, then he starts banging people's heads on tables and fake medical examinations, and then he's in drag. And these scenes are hilarious in the recons, and I can only imagine what they would actually have looked like if the story existed. And that's one of the reasons why I get so high, just because I'd love to see some of these on the actual prints. Reason 5. The Highlanders is very much what I'd call an action historical, where the actual historical elements of the story are largely in the background to make room for the story, and when you said anything during a war in the past, you're going to get a giant 3-minute-long sword fight in episode 4, which you can experience only through still images and a lot of people going, "Ah!" Basically what I'm saying is that the Highlanders is driven heavily by action, meaning it translates very poorly to a reconstruction. Reason 6. The director of this story, Hugh David, clearly knows his trade, having also directed Fury from the Deep, so I believe I can assume that the Highlanders looked equally as stunning, at least in a visual sense, and the telesnaps seem to back up that assumption. Finally, reason 7. I mentioned earlier that the Highlanders has an extremely strong guest cast, and I didn't even mention the leads. Troughton, as I said, is hilarious and is clearly having a great time throughout the story. Fraser Hines gives a solid first outing. Michael Craze gives one of his best performances as Ben, a character that generally leaves quite little impression on me in his stories, and I tend to forget his roles in episodes. Now, that's nothing against Michael Craze, rather the writing just generally didn't treat him very well. He doesn't completely escape that trap with the Highlanders, but he does so more than most of his other stories. In fact, I think the only serial where he plays a real significant role and a memorable role throughout the entire serial is the Macra Terror. Also, Michael Craze just seems to be having a lot of fun with this story, and that's really the reason I think I've come to like the Highlanders so much as a story. Everyone involved just seems to be having so much fun. And that brings me to the final main cast member, Annika Wills. Now, Polly has got to be the most underrated companion of all time. Say what you will about Perry or Nyssa, but they've all got followings. Polly's the one I see always forgotten. Now, a lot of that is certainly due to her missing a larger percentage of her episodes than any other companion that is in more than 2 stories, but I think a lot of it is also just down to her being lumped into the Screamer companions with Mel and Victoria, who don't really do much other than get in trouble and scream for help, and are just generally useless about 95% of the time. I'd really like to do a full video on this topic at some point, on the topic of Polly being underrated, but for now, just suffice to say that I think Polly is so much more than that. Yes, she does scream a lot, and she has some bad stories for that, especially the Underwater Menace and the Macra Terror. But the character herself is really good, and nowhere is that better shown than in the Highlanders. I dare anyone who thinks Polly is a weak character to watch the Highlanders and still think that that is the case, as this is, beyond a shadow of a doubt, Polly's best episode. Elwyn Jones and Jerry Davis understood her character in a way that no other writer in Season 4 did, which makes it all the more sad that this is the story that's missing. Well, I suppose all the stories from Season 4 are missing, but this one is more missing than a lot of them because it has no episode surviving. And anyway, that's because, it's sad because it's the only serial where Polly really shines, and her reputation has suffered significantly from that. But I've gone really long on this one already. So to summarize, The Highlanders gets into the top 10 because it's missing all 4 of its episodes. It's the first story to feature Jamie McCrimmon. It features an extremely strong guest cast and stellar performances from the leads. It's a very action-driven story and so translates poorly to reconstruction. It features a lot of funny scenes that I would love to see. It had great direction, and it's Polly's best story, a companion that is generally seen as fairly poor. The Highlanders doesn't get higher, though, because of its somewhat mediocre story and general lack of focus throughout, but really, it's just because I like the 9 above it even more, and I think that they suffer from being lost even more than this one. Number 9, The Macra Terror. There seems to be a running theme of best stories for companions, this being the 4th story in a row to have that honor. We started with number 12, Stephen's Best, The Massacre, then we moved on to Dodo's Best, number 11, The Savages, then we had Polly's Best, The Highlanders, number 10, and now we have number 9, The Macra Terror, which is Ben's best. However, unlike the last 3, that is not a major factor in why this story gets so high on this list, because while the last 3, we had companions with poor reputations that actually had a lot of depth and character that is forgotten because their best episodes are missing, with Ben, though, The Macra Terror is definitely his best story, yes, it's the only one where he plays a significant role throughout. However, I do not believe that there are otherwise unseen facets of its character that come to light in this story, because say what you will, and I'm sure that saying this is going to cause controversy, but Ben's a pretty flat character. I mean, what do we really know about him? He's a dependable sailor with a thing for Polly, and that's not necessarily bad. I would also call Harry Sullivan a flat character, but that doesn't make him not endearing and not fun to watch. There just isn't a lot to learn about their personalities outside of those few basic aspects, and so even episodes where they feature heavily, like with Ben and the Macra Terror, the character gets the focus, but it's just the character we already know from other stories, just with more screen time, and again, that's not necessarily bad. I'm very glad that Ben had a serial where he features heavily because, like I said in the last entry, he always played second fiddle to Polly in the Hartnell era and Jamie in the Troughton era. Nevertheless, as I said, his general lack of depth and hidden facets mean that the Macra Terror being his best story doesn't really add much to his character and doesn't swing the story itself nearly as high as the Massacre, the Savages, or the Highlanders. It also doesn't help that Michael Craze isn't really playing Ben for a majority of this story, rather a brainwashed version of Ben who acts differently. But I've talked enough about Ben. Let's get to the Macra Terror itself. First and most obviously, all 4 episodes of this story are missing, and the only footage we have are a few clips from episode 2 and 3. Having said that, though, as far as missing stories go, the Macra Terror works reasonably well as a reconstruction, and probably better than most of the other science fiction stories, and especially more than the other Season 4 Troughtons. The Macra Terror features a lot of talking and dialogue scenes that translate well to recons. These are countered, however, by a lot of long action scenes with basically no dialogue. Examples that come to mind are the heartbeat chase from episode 1, Polly and Ben's encounter with the Macra in episode 2, and especially Jamie's exploration of the old shaft in episode 3. All that said, though, if there's one thing that keeps the Macra Terror from being higher on this list, it's that of all the completely missing stories, it is the only one that I think I can visualize reasonably well with what we have, which is the telesnaps. And I can't say why I find that, especially considering it has one of the lowest average telesnap counts of any story. There's something about this serial that just works as a recon, and it's one of the few stories I think might actually suffer somewhat from recovery because the Macra, well, they just kind of flail around, don't they?
They were very strange creatures. I only saw one in the studio. And my impression of that was it was rather large, half a coconut.
I'll talk more about atmosphere and subtlety that fails catastrophically as a recon in the final part of the series, but somehow in the Macra Terror, that atmosphere and that subtlety works, and that's the main reason why this story doesn't get higher on this list. that and the fact that I just like the remaining 8 more. At this point in the list, one of the most important factors in ranking is just which I like the most. This entire list is kind of like a graph curve at this point, where the closer we get to the top, the closer together the story are in ranking, and so the more interchangeable they really are. Because you start to reach a point where there aren't factors like extant episodes or weak story elements that knock down serials lower in the rankings, just factors that elevate them higher above others. And the Macra Terror is the last story on this list to be slightly docked for its story, because even though the plot is great in the first 2 episodes and into episode 3, it kind of falls apart near the end of Act 2. It builds great atmosphere in the first 2 episodes and reaches its peak with the episode 2 cliffhanger and the death of the real controller. After that, though, the story kind of drops off in terms of complexity, execution, and atmosphere. It's not bad, it's just, it turns into a bit of a generic runaround versus the lurking horror that the first 2 episodes were. And I think a lot of that is just down to the fact that everything got revealed at the end of episode 2 and left nowhere for the story to advance in terms of atmosphere. But anyway, I've talked enough about the Macra Terror, so I'll just end it here. I'll clarify a bit more about structure and atmosphere and such if I do a full review of the Macra Terror. For now, though, just know that the Macra Terror gets where it is because it's missing all of its episode. It features a lot of action scenes that translate poorly to a reconstruction. It's a highly enjoyable story, and episodes 1, 2, and to a lesser degree 3 feature some of the best world building and atmosphere building that the show has ever seen. Nevertheless, episode 4, and again to a lesser degree episode 3, are still fairly weak, and again, I just prefer other stories. Number 8. The Faceless Ones. When people ask me what I think the best introduction story for the Second Doctor is, I will always say The Faceless Ones, which makes it terrible that it's missing because there really isn't any other starter Troughton material. Most of them are either substandard like The Dominators, or too long for a starter story as in The War Games, or in the case of The Enemy of the World and The Mind Robber, just too different from the rest of the Second Doctor's era to be a good starter story, kind of like how Blink is too different from the rest of the modern series to be an effective introduction episode to that. That just leaves the Tomb of the Cybermen, but with Tomb, I don't know. I guess it works, but it really plays into the preconceived stereotypes of the era. Kind of cheesy effects, people putting on bad American accents, the strong, silent black guy who was a servant to the other white characters. I don't know. Just overall, it doesn't seem to me like a very good starting story for Troughton, or at least not compared to some of his other stories. And that's not to say it's a bad story. It's a great story, but I think the main reason people recommend Tomb as a starter Troughton story is just because it's the only surviving one that can serve in that capacity. The Power of the Daleks, the Moon Base, and the Abominable Snowman are all excellent starter Troughton stories, but they're all missing. The king of them, though, for me at least, is The Faceless Ones. It's an excellent story. It defies the stereotypes of the era, it's easily understandable and accessible, and it is an excellent example of both what Troughton's era is like as a whole, and of what the Second Doctor is capable of, and what he's like, as he is both goofy and cunning in the serial, without ever leaning too far either way. Basically, this is, to me, the quintessential guide on how to write a Second Doctor story, as it covers all the most important elements of his era. Add to that, it's just a really good story. I truly believe it to be one of the lost classics. The writing and characters are great. Captain Blade just exudes menace. The story is extremely compelling. Some say it's a bit slow, and I can see where they're coming from, but I wasn't bored a second of the time. And that's even considering the fact that we're missing 4 of the 6 episodes. We do have telesnaps for the story, though, and the 2 existing episodes, episode 1 and episode 3, give us a good idea of what episodes 2 and 4 and 5 looked like, but episode 6 is a complete mystery. It's a complete switch of location and tone to the rest of the story, and that makes it impossible to effectively visualize. Additionally, this story is Ben and Polly's departure serial, even though they disappear halfway through, and any story featuring the 2 of them automatically gets higher in the rankings due to how few of their episodes survive. So basically, The Faceless Ones is missing 2/3 of its episodes. It's a great story. Episode 6 is almost impossible to visualize, and it would be the perfect introduction story to the Second Doctor's era. However, episodes 2, 4, and 5 can be effectively visualized through reconstruction. There are stories missing more and that suffer more, and there are serials that are even better. Number 7, Marco Polo. Marco Polo is the 4th Doctor Who story and the first to be missing, and not only is it missing, but it is one of the most missing. It is a 7-part story, and all 7 parts are missing. It's one of only 3 stories, along with The Massacre and Mission to the Unknown, to have no surviving footage whatsoever. We do have telesnaps for 6 out of the 7 episodes, though, the only exception being episode 4, so I wouldn't consider Marco Polo to be as missing as, say, The Mythmakers, because even though The Mythmakers does have surviving footage, it has no telesnaps, which makes it honestly more missing than Marco Polo. Telesnaps are just so important in visualizing and reconstructing a story that the lack of them is such a major blow. Regardless, Marco Polo still is one of the most missing stories, which is one of the reasons it gets up this high. Being 7 episodes long, it's missing more episodes than any other story save the Daleks' master plan, and the fact that we have only telesnaps and one of the poorer quality soundtracks to represent this story play a major role in bringing it up to 7th. And I say poorer quality soundtrack just because it was one of the earlier ones that Graham Strong didn't record. The audio's still fine, it's just not quite as good as Graham Strong's. Additionally, Marco Polo is the only major hole in the first 2 seasons of Doctor Who, and the only major hole in the runs of Ian, Barbara, and Susan. If this story were to be recovered in its entirety, it would leave only 4 episodes missing from the entirety of the first 2 seasons. As I've stated before in the Space Pirates and the Crusade, though, completing a season or filling up the only major hole in a season are fairly minor benefits compared to other factors such as the quality of the story or the amount missing. Now, for a long time, for me, Marco Polo is much lower on this list, but since then, on rewatches, I've seen the allure of it. Yes, it works extremely well as a reconstruction, arguably better than any other story except in its handful of fight scenes, but it's not in the story or in a failure of translation to reconstruction that brings Marco Polo this high. If that were the case, it would be closer to its previous position, around 13th or 14th. No, Marco Polo is 8th for a different reason. It's just a beautiful serial. All over, the entire thing has been meticulously written and crafted to just be as excellent and great as it could. The production values seem to be among the best and highest the show has ever seen. The sets and costumes are all incredibly realistic and incredibly beautiful, and the aesthetics of the story are just breathtaking, and that's only from watching a recon. Still images. I can only imagine what it might have looked like if it actually existed, and that's really why it gets up so high. It's almost entirely missing, and its aesthetics are amazing. The only things that hold it back are my own personal preference, in that I prefer other stories to this one, and the fact that the story does work quite well as a reconstruction, but I believe I'm safe in saying that there has never been, and will never be, another story that looks and feels quite the same way that Marco Polo does. And finally, number 6, Mission to the Unknown. Finishing off today's list, we have another story that would probably be a lot lower on other people's lists, but I just can't put Mission to the Unknown any lower than 6th. A lot of people overlook this one. I mean, it's only 1 episode long, the shortest story of all time, at least televised, and it's really more of a prequel than an independent story. The Doctor doesn't even show up. These unique aspects of it don't necessarily make it forgettable. People remember the story, but I don't find that a lot linger on it either. Most I've seen just tend to skip from the Time Meddler straight to the Daleks' master plan. I mean, it makes sense why they might do that. Galaxy 4 is kind of mediocre, the Mythmakers is completely missing and has no telesnaps, and Mission to the Unknown is, as I said, a 1 episode long prequel that isn't really even necessary to understand the Daleks' master plan. It's more just providing a little bit of context. If the Massacre is the most missing, and the Savages is the most forgotten, Mission to the Unknown is the most overlooked, and the second most missing, I suppose. I mean, what really does it have going for it? Is it known for having good writing? No. Is it known for having good performances? Not really. Is it known for having great direction? No. Nevertheless, here it is in 6th place, above 20 other stories. What is it about it? Well, first off, as I said, it's the second most missing story behind The Massacre, only taking second because it's shorter, and its set gets reused for the Daleks' master plan. We don't even have surviving visual record of our 2 stand-in heroes, for crying out loud. This story has no telesnaps, no surviving clips, although it does have a surprisingly high number of production photos, but they're all of the Dalek Council, not Mark, Corey, Gordon Lowry, or Jeff Garvey, the people we spend the majority of the runtime with. Otherwise, the script is one of Terry Nation's best, and the performances from Edward D'Souza, Jeremy Young, and Barry Jackson are all excellent. Oddly, the thing that boosts Mission to the Unknown this high in the list, though, is its animation. This story is weird because it's the only episode to be professionally animated but not officially released, having been created on private commission, and ironically, it's arguably the best. It's the only one that could challenge the Moonbase, in my opinion, for best animation. However, whereas animations like the Moonbase and the Ice Warriors satisfy my desire to watch the actual prints by creating satisfactory stand-ins, the Mission animation just makes me want to see the original print even more. Like the Celestial Toymaker, Mission to the Unknown translates extremely well to animation, and it allowed me to see the true potential of the story in a way that the Recon does not. Being 1 episode long, it's extremely tight and extremely fast-paced with minimal padding, and that just makes Mission fly by. The characters are compelling and you really want them to win. Really what I'm trying to say is that while the animation is incredible, it's also allowed us a glimpse into what the original episode might have looked like and given us a taste of how good the original might have been. Yet the only way we'd ever know whether or not that taste is actually representative of the real episode is if we found the episode itself, and given that only one, possibly two, copies of this story were ever shipped abroad, the chances of that happening are extremely unlikely. So, in summary, Mission to the Unknown is sixth because it is one of the most lost serials, and the animation that we have of it hints at a thrilling, fast-paced, and emotionally charged episode that will probably remain forever lost. Nevertheless, it is only one episode missing, whereas the stories in the top 5 are all missing between 4 and 6. Also, as I said, the animation is incredibly good, so even if the actual episode is never found, we'll still have a satisfactory replacement. But that replacement will still be only a teaser for the classic we could have had. Well, that's it for this episode. Join me next time for the thrilling conclusion to this ranking series, the top 5. See you then, and thanks for watching.